let me ask you a couple questions about kind of immunology and allergy. I guess I have two questions. My first one is related to the whole pandemic, like the fact that for me, I have little seasonal allergies in the spring. 2020 was my best year ever. There was no pollution, no one was driving. I was masking like crazy. I didn't have a sniffle. Was that kind of common that people their allergies got better?
Oh yeah, my practice was very quiet at that time. People were very healthy because they were masking, so you're filtering out a lot of the allergens that you're experiencing. People who had outdoor allergens weren't really going outside as much. I mean, the foot traffic, if you look at some of the data, people were really staying indoors for quite some time. Now, there was a bump in people with pet allergies because a lot of people were adopting pets who probably shouldn't have, and they ended up getting indoor pet allergens and things like that. But overall, between allergies and asthma, we were doing quite well in that year. But once everybody started opening up again and traveling, more air pollution, pollen counts have been steadily rising. It seems like every year it's worse and worse and worse now. There's some long-term data to suggest that we're going to have pollen season lasting for a month longer in the next 50 to 100 years.
And your patient population is probably the one I'm interested in this question. Long COVID for kids, I imagine that kids who have allergies or kids who sort of have atopic conditions in general might be a little more predisposed. Tell me what you're seeing with long COVID in terms of how long is it lasting? How common is it?
Right.
Because for me, I know this is a major problem, but I also think that the data don't quite match what I'm seeing on the ground. So I'm curious where you fall.
Right. So every physician who deals with long COVID is seeing a different phenotype. That's one of the problems, is that some people are dealing with brain fog and some of the neurological issues. Some people are dealing with the POTS issues, right? And it's not all one clinical entity. So as a pediatric allergist, what I see primarily are skin problems. So chronic hives after getting COVID, where it's lasting for like 6 months.
Wow.
Where they're getting almost daily hives. That's one phenotype. I have another subset where I just call them COVID coughers because they get COVID, they haven't stopped coughing for months. And so usually that's lasting for about 6 months is what I'm seeing in my population. And I also take care of adults too. So about 30% of my practice is actually adults. I'm certified to take care of all ages. But in terms of kids, I'm putting a lot of kids on inhaled steroids that I wouldn't have expected because they didn't have allergic rhinitis. Like if you skin test them, a lot of them are negative. So they don't have kind of that allergic disease that's going on, right? These aren't kids who started off with eczema and dealing with chronic hives or chronic cough. So they're not the typical population. So that's what's a little strange to me with what I'm dealing with. I do have, this is not, I'm not saying this quite as much, but earlier in the pandemic, when we had earlier iterations of the virus that was causing a lot of anosmia or lack of smell, I saw a lot of teens and young adults who had problems with smell, whether they couldn't smell at all or they had parosmia, where they're smelling things that is just rancid and it just didn't quite make sense.
Right.
And so, that is something that my ENT colleagues and I have been seeing quite a bit. Not quite as much now because the virus is not really sitting in the nose quite as much. It's kind of in other areas now. But these are people who are having symptoms anywhere between 6 to 12 months or longer, which is a really, really challenging issue for those patients.
And I'm kind of wondering, let me pursue this just a little bit more because I know that I have a kid. I have 2 kids, and I remember being a kid. There's always a kid or two who had chronic bronchitis. The kid who always had a cold or a sniffle, and probably if you think about it, they're probably just their body, their immune system was destined to be that way, or they had exposures, more than the rest of us. And so I just wonder, is this COVID causing this increase itself? In other words, the native pathogen meets person, and COVID just more likely to cause that, or is this like a reaction to the fact that any virus of this sort of in this sort of echelon of badness for kids would do this. It's just that COVID is 100 times more prevalent and more contagious than the other ones. And so all of a sudden, 1 in 100 kids who gets virus will get this longer term thing you're describing. But guess what, folks? It's just 100 times more common. I mean, which one is it?
It's really hard to say that. I mean, I get what you're trying to say, and that does make sense. But what concerns me is when you see studies where they're comparing, this is the type 1 diabetes issue that I'm sure you're familiar with. So there are more kids now being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes after COVID compared to if they had another respiratory virus. So we're seeing studies like that when we compare it. And that's where I start to say, oh gosh, I think COVID is actually causing more severe issues when you start comparing these larger data sets of kids who have gotten COVID compared to kids who got just some other respiratory virus, and you age match them and you say, okay, actually the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes is higher. So when you see data like that, that's where I say, yeah, I think COVID's actually worse just in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, we know it's the mayhem that it's caused. It's just a question of, is it sort of, I just call this, when I study excess mortality, meaning how many people die compared to how many are expected to. And we talk about this idea of like a mortality product. Do people, is it each case, out of every 100 cases, is it actually deadlier? Yes. And it's just, are there more cases? Yes. So it's both. But I just don't know that for other parts of the spectrum, like for long COVID, for example. Do you sense, we're running out of time, but do you sense that long COVID or just chronic, even medium COVID, or what you want to call it, sort of like 2, 3, 4, 6 months of misery, do you sense that this is getting better with higher vaccination rates, or is it just too soon to tell?
I think it's too soon to tell, honestly. These are things that are going to take, the 6 to 12 month to 24-month range of really just getting larger data and seeing more patients and seeing where this goes. Because unfortunately, the virus continually mutates, and we're getting these more immune evasive variants like BQ.1.1 and XBB, as some people coin Scrabble COVID because of these letters that are like the highest, scoring Scrabble letters. More and more infections is not necessarily a good thing. And so we have to see how that ends up playing out. There is a higher level of population immunity with more exposure and more vaccinations, but what concerns me is the uptake of this bivalent booster. Unfortunately, this is a type of virus where we do need to be boosted more regularly until we get a better vaccine coming around to try to help protect, especially the most vulnerable population.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question. It's a kind of a hypothetical, but I think I want your take on it. Let's just there's a lot of people out there who they're really concerned about the lost year of school, or more, this terrible outcomes in terms of that. But I often think about, okay, why don't we have the outcome of interest for all of our interventions just be days in class, how many days kids are in school? Do you think that if we could test kids weekly for RSV and flu and COVID and have them put masks on during surges, that would lead to kids being in school more?
I think so. I think if we're able to try to slow the spread by identifying who's sick, taking them out, and continually masking when there's surges, like right now, this would be the time to have masks back in school. I mean, now we're going to be in winter break, right? But the few weeks that come after winter break may be a good idea to do that so that kids don't come back and they spread a bunch of virus, whether it's COVID, RSV, influenza, or this newer concern that's going to start. We're going to start seeing this in national media now. The concern of strep A and invasive group A strep. That is, like, when I see that, it's like 10 times higher in Colorado right now. That is very alarming to me. You don't want kids getting invasive group A strep in the setting of a antibiotic shortage. I think we need to pick and choose when we do these types of interventions, and they can be short term, but they could definitely, there's a lot of potential for success, because we have seen in Boston, there was a really good study from the New England Journal that the schools that held onto those mask mandates longer had lower COVID transmission compared to those that dropped it earlier. And I'm sure you probably heard of that study. So that was a very impactful one that I think we can take lessons from that and not forget how certain mitigation strategies can be helpful when we pick and choose it. Unfortunately, we haven't invested enough in our schools to have improved ventilation, because I think that's an area that's not been tapped into well. If we improve ventilation in these older buildings, I actually think that would be a big deal in helping keeping kids school as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the simple stuff is actually pretty consensus. If you literally, I talked to Joseph Allen about this, if you just open the window for 10 minutes an hour, you actually have an air change that can make a huge difference. Keep the kids in school. Throw the mask on for a week here and there. We don't have to have the debate about whether having it on for a year hurt them or helped them. I think it probably helped, but I don't. At this point, that's in the past. But if you throw these things on for a week, you really break a circuit. And then the teacher's not out, or then half the class isn't out, and we have had schools where this classroom is just shut down because it's just we're not doing the things that we know prevent these spread. And it's actually slowing these things down is not delaying the inevitable. It's keeping the overall environment relatively safe. So I think we see eye to eye on this on a lot of issues. Zach, tell us where to find you on social.
So my handle is the same for all of my social media. It's at Rubin, Rubin _allergy. So I'm on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I'm debating about what I'm doing with Twitter with everything going on with Elon Musk, so I've got Med Mastodon too. It's the same thing, but I don't know what I'm going to do with that. But I'm primarily on TikTok and Instagram at this point. So happy to, collaborate with you in the future. This has been great. I know we've kind of followed each other over the last few years, but it's nice to be able to finally talk with you.
Absolutely, yeah. And I know this audience will have a lot of questions. We'll loop them back to you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And have a great night.
You too. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Zach.